1, 2, 3, 4.
If great places don't happen by accident, how do they happen? Welcome to Third Placemakers Talk, where we explore the people, ideas, and projects shaping the places where we live, work, gather, and belong. I'm your host, Ivy Woodrow. In every episode, we'll sit down with the thinkers, practitioners, and changemakers from across industries who are behind remarkable places. Because creating meaningful places takes all kinds of people who share one common goal: creating places that foster connection, strengthen community, and leave a lasting impact. So let's get to it. Welcome to Third Placemakers Talk. Before we jump in to today's conversation, let's take a minute to level set with today's industry insight. Think of it as a shared foundation for the conversation you're about to hear. Today's industry insight is place-led development, which is an approach to development that begins with people rather than projects. Instead of asking, what should we build here? It asks, what kind of place do we want people to experience? The idea is that when you prioritize community, public life, identity, and long-term experience, economic success often follows, not the other way around. And I couldn't think of a better person to kick off this series than today's guest. Ethan Kent has spent decades helping shape the global placemaking movement, working with communities in more than 1,000 cities across 65 countries. He's the executive director and co-founder of PlacemakingThe and has helped refine how cities, organizations, and developers think about creating places that truly serve people. Ethan, welcome to Third Placemakers Talk.
Thank you so much, Ivy. Really happy to be here. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, super excited to have you. So Ethan, I intentionally defined place-led development instead of placemaking because I thought it would be way more meaningful for our listeners to hear that definition from someone who has really shaped the movement. So when someone asks you, what is placemaking, how do you answer?
Well, first of all, thank you for that good definition of place-led development. And that is actually something I want to talk about with you more, because that is actually where we think the placemaking movement is going. But where it's come from is really this word placemaking. It's fraught, it's undefined, it's fuzzy, and that's actually what's been so powerful about it. And it's a word we started using actually when I first joined Project for Public Spaces in the sort of mid to late 90s. To at that time to put a word to the different principles and tools that Project for Public Spaces had been using since the 70s, or sort of developing since the 70s, to really turn upside down the shaping of cities, to start with people in public spaces, and the various principles that the community is the expert. You're creating a place, not a design. These ideas that placemaking is a process. It's a learning agenda. And it really disrupts and reconnects the many disciplines shaping public spaces. So, back then we just defined placemaking as a process to maximize the shared value of a public space. But we're really, frankly, seeing it evolve to be really how people and places build each other up. Again, it needs to be grounded in short-term action and in the skills of really making public spaces work. And how we participate and engage everyone in participating in that shaping and definition process, and it's helping to sort of reground and and energize everybody participating in really civilization building again. I think we're at a low point in our agency globally in how we shape our public realm in our society.
Absolutely.
And, there's crises around democracy and participation and sort of passive consumption and such, and we see placemaking as a way to sort of reinvent and re-energize all of our creativity and agency in shaping our world.
Amazing. I love that. So with kind of the history of our industry, where our weak points are, what makes it fuzzy, we're a young industry, but we're not infants necessarily. And there's still a lot of people that are adjacent to the industry or support the industry that still don't understand the value of having a placemaker or placemaking principles implemented in their developments, their environments. So who is it really important for to know who we are, and why would it benefit them so significantly?
Yeah, so we're trying to build placemaking as a field, as an industry, but we see it as different than other disciplines. We see placemaking as it's not a competing force, but one that disrupts the silos of different disciplines and then draws them together. So in some ways, some of the disciplines see placemaking as a little threatening because it's
Yes.
it's what they're missing, and what's and it isn't, as there isn't sort of the full professional accreditation, and it's not so defined in that way. So a lot of the disciplines are trying to co-opt it, where they're saying, oh, we do, the landscape architects say we do placemaking, and the architects and the planners and the developers are all, but really we'll best create demand for their solutions and their skills by recentering the process and the conversation in place and communities, but it needs to be led by a person, or a team of people that are really have a long-term holistic responsibility in a community, to facilitate that community's vision, its collective capacity and ownership, and its ability to draw more effectively on the different disciplines and departments and resources that can be available to it through a strong placemaking process.
I love that. I always, when people ask me, I always identify the placemaker in the room as kind of the glue
Yeah,
to pull everything together and kind of finish that recipe when you have a ton of cooks in the kitchen. So I think
no,
you
it's
give a much more
organizing.
articulate explanation.
Yeah, no, but those skills, the skills of organizing and facilitation and connecting people, are not the skills that are really taught in a lot of the built environment professions, and frankly not in schools in general. We're taught to be experts, and we're taught to tell people what they need and push solutions. We're not taught to inspire, connect, facilitate, organize, and connect people to resources. It's a humble role too. It's a leadership role, but it's sort of a facilitative leadership role.
Yes, definitely. I feel like I have had those conversations with people in the past about kind of being an expert in one thing or being that Jill of all trades, where you just really have an understanding of a lot of different buckets and you can come in and be really strategic on what knowledge you can pull. And specifically, the bid world really gives an opportunity for a placemaker, I think, to get the best knowledge kind of dumped on them all at once in one role before stepping into something bigger, like projects for public spaces or placemaking X, or kind of doing their own work as consultants.
Role. So at Project for Public Spaces, I was able to be a consultant. I was lucky to get to work in thousands of communities around the world, and but our goal was always to build a movement and build the capacity of communities to do this themselves. So we spun off from PPS about 7-8 years ago now, to form Placemaking X, to really focus fully on sort of the network building, the collective learning and advocacy of people around the world that are kind of alone doing this work. And so we don't really do consulting anymore, but we are really focused on we've now launched 35 national and regional placemaking networks. So there's a
That is
placemaking US
incredible.
network, but there's ones in, I was recently talking to our placemaking Mongolia network, and the Nepalese network, and there's the Mexican network, and the Canadian, and they're all connected. They all cross fertilize each other because each part of the world is leading and defining placemaking slightly differently. But there's strengths to that, and they also need to be balanced. So every part of the world, because of those imbalances, actually has unique elements to offer and inspire others with. So we're trying to sort of network these conversations. There's pretty much placemaking conferences on each habitable continent every year, and with
That's
it, there's
incredible.
cross fertilization between the leaders and so forth. Yeah.
So, speaking of kind of branching off from PPS about 7, 8 years ago, tell me really what, aside from just kind of its mission, how did it happen? Why are you the one who did it? And where is it filling that value in, really telling the story and connecting the dots?
Yeah. So we were I think the goal always was to build a movement. So my father founded Project for Public Spaces in 1975, but before that, he actually organized the first Earth Day in 1970. So I grew up
Oh,
around a lot of the founders of the environmental movement, and really saw movement building as sort of a goal. I grew up around many sort of social movement leaders and studied with a lot of them, but also the environmental movement. We My father kind of left it in a way because it wasn't about people in cities, and and it wasn't achieving its goals. Frankly, it was about sort of how do we impact less, not how do we all impact more, and achieve sustainability in the process. And so we, so he sort of went from big environmental agendas to making cities work at the human scale, and engaging people's agency and power, and creativity, not just their sort of guilt and just responsibility alone wasn't going to create enough collective power and energy to solve our environmental crisis. So it was always, we wanted to reconnect the city building, the community building movements with the environmental movement. Has always been sort of our long-term goal. And I sort of came in to PPS right at this time when they'd sort of started to take these ideas that they'd been applying around the country. They'd worked in every downtown in the U.S. and turned around a lot of the key public spaces, and and worked in 40 countries at that time, I think. And and I was really excited. Well, how do we take this momentum and turn it into a movement? And how do we, we develop some principles of placemaking, different diagrams and tools that are now used, really in every corner of the world. But the goal of, we first launched our really movement building, network building work with UN Habitat in 2012. And we had a conference actually in Detroit in 2013, launching the sort of network building efforts. And the goal there was to decentralize the movement outside of PPS, because a movement can't be run by an organization or a person. A movement by nature is decentralized.
Absolutely.
And more democratic. And so that was where we started our sort of network approach, sort of really connecting and highlighting the people innovating on this around the world. And every city, every country has people like this that, again, we're sort of alone. That part of it was helping them feel like they're part of something larger, and that telling that they're not crazy because they're doing these sort of out of the box sort of approach,
Challenging
so
the
it was
status
actually kind of
quo.
easy. Yeah, it was actually kind of easy to these people we'd been connecting with around the world, and they're amazing people, and that's the best. That's what's most rewarding and energizing to me, is they're just. My father calls them zealous nuts. They're always a little passionate, not defined by their discipline, and they're have a good crazy. But he thinks all great places can be tracked back to a zealous nut, a placemaker of some kind. And so how we, and their learning is just infinite. How they're learning so much more than anyone could in any box. So how do we highlight, support them, and learn from them, and network their learning. And that's what's just amazing, and how they're so connected and deeply rooted in their communities, but also eager to learn from and support people doing this work.
Amazing. I love that from one zealous placemaker. I'm going to remember that. It's kind of like all roads lead to Rome, but
Yeah,
all cities lead to a zealous placemaker. How fun.
for sure, for sure.
So I'd love to hear a little bit of some stories from you. I'm curious if there's one city that stands out as one that surprised you the most. Maybe you had lower expectations for what they could offer or who you were meeting, and they just kind of took you for a turn.
Well, let's. I mean, the best story to talk about probably is Detroit first. Is how we both were just there for the placemaking week. And that's the city we've probably learned the most from. And it's been the placemaking movement and impact has been led by various sectors at different times. And that's sort of the lesson there is I think you're building an ecosystem, and you're building a larger narrative, a larger story, that is seated, again, in this case, in very small, low cost actions, and sort of activations of public spaces. The story there started for us first. Actually, the first project I was involved with in a very small way was in the late '90s. My father was invited to help develop a vision for campus marshes, working with the mayor convened it, but they had no resources at the time, and
Which is a
they
great
brought
place
together.
now.
Yes, yeah, it's an amazing place now, um, but it was the sort of convening, organizing process of bringing together the business leaders and some philanthropic leaders to create a center. There was at the time this is the center of Detroit, where you measure all distances from, so 8 miles out from Campus Martius is and it was just, basically the traffic engineers, the architects, the planners, the economic development people had all made all the biggest mistakes in Detroit, and that have, it's all place taking, the way that place making, and so, but off of that void, that offered an opportunity to really turn things around, turn things upside down, and lead with a public destination. We did this vision that attracted the $20 million was necessary to build this 2.5 acre park, and that park then attracted billions of dollars of investment downtown. Some like CompuWare and other corporations moving downtown. Eventually, Dan Gilbert brought his Quicken Loans company downtown, and he hired us, 10 or so years later to sort of take the public spaces of downtown to the next level through what we called sort of a lighter, quicker, cheaper activation plan that he was able to implement within months. And it was, not fancy design, but lots of short-term changes.
Through kind of tactical pilot programs.
Exactly. Yeah. And, and storefront activations, and we put a beach at the center of Campus Martius, right as Detroit was declaring bankruptcy in 2012, 2013. And that became sort of the catalyst. And, and we also worked with foundations in some of the lower income neighborhoods that were really challenged, applying the same principles, building the ecosystem of leaders and the collective narrative of how people can shape their city, and, local people first and foremost, obviously, but also attracting people from further to contribute to the narrative, that sort of that innovation ecosystem, that entrepreneurial ecosystem that Detroit's now pretty well known for. That you can come there and help have an impact. It's small enough to have an impact. You can be part of the story, but it also challenges locals, tourists, investors to conform to the strong culture that's defined locally. And there's tensions and there's imbalances, as always. But ideally, those tensions and imbalances continue to fuel creativity, and in an effort to support larger equity goals that are big challenges. Obviously, continue to be big challenges for Detroit.
Absolutely. Detroit is really a great example of kind of being at your lowest low and leveraging placemaking principles to bring a city back to life. I mean, I knew quite a bit about Detroit prior to going for Placemaking Week, but I learned a significant amount more when I just visited. I just didn't really understand how many other potential falls they really had that they had to keep saving themselves from. When we're thinking of, Campus Martius, can you walk us through kind of what that looked like when they brought you, by the point that they brought you in and you did the beach? What other organizations did you collaborate with? What were some of the biggest maybe pieces of red tape and challenges that you had to get through to bring a project like that to opening day?
Yeah, so I mean, in that case, we had a long time relationship with the place manager of downtown Detroit, which was Bob Gregory, who's a person we'd actually worked with even before he was involved in Campus Martius. He was on various projects in Detroit, and he's unfortunately since passed. But he's that zealous nut, that leader that
always leads back to one.
that made it all happen, and brought us in at the right times that we're grateful for, and we learned way more from him than he learned from us, I think. But that he again navigated the different sort of sways in investment. It takes someone to sort of help other people feel like it's their project. To the different corporations, the corporate leaders, the foundation leaders, the political leaders, and again, to just not let anyone dominate it. Actually, it's always important that if any sector or discipline or ego dominates it or has too much credit in a way, it makes it vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so public space, is always about maximizing the public goals, and it's not a zero-sum game. We want this infinite ownership and contribution that a space like that can enable and benefit from. And so really seeing it as a programmable, flexible space that people can project onto their goals, their memories, their meaning. And of course, people get married there. It's become the sort of heart of the city, of the region. Went from really no level layers of purpose and meaning, except for moving through the center of the city to the glue that connects it all. And And Bob Gregory, built the capacity of other people that are now, continuing his work at Downtown Detroit Partnership and around downtown and around the state. Michigan is leading on placemaking in many levels. The beach, though, was actually funded by, it was sort of our foray into getting corporate philanthropy involved. Something I'd led at Project for Public Spaces, getting Southwest Airlines in this case to help start placemaking as a cause, and we worked in 20 of the cities that they fly to create centers to activate public spaces and squares, train local leaders, and offer small grants to do small activations at the size of a room, really, the size of the beach. Um, and it was quite impactful in almost all those cities. But the beach really helped kick off that project, and it was the informality of it, the flexibility, the affordability of the project that made it so powerful, and that people could literally sit in a beach chair and touch the sand and move it. If made it
In the middle of an urban
social, in the
environment.
middle of an urban environment, made it so people felt like it's so informal. People are most, we've actually done studies that people bridge difference and are most informal and comfortable, in a market, a playground, or a beach, um, and that beach is just the simplest way to really turn around the story of Detroit, and get people to be comfortable around each other and relaxed and open, and start to develop memories and connections in the center of the city.
I love that, and I couldn't agree more. I'd love kind of talking about that study of how people experience spaces and how they feel like they can let their shoulders down and their hair back. When you're thinking of projects, you're in 1,000 cities and 65 countries. I'd love to hear if you have identified any differences in the way that the US, Canada, and other countries really experience placemaking, place-led development, and how it's received. What are some of those foundational principles that are just black and white from here to there?
Yeah, so I sort of mentioned that every part of the world, I think, defines it a little differently, but really their definition is more a product of the strength of where it's initiated. So in some parts of the world, in like Australia and Singapore, um, and Sweden, the placemaking is more initiated by the government, and that's a strength. But it's also, in their cases, they are lacking the sort of the collaboration, the informality, the innovation of the private sector, the community sector, the nonprofit sector, philanthropic, and so forth. And so they often, the work we've done with them is actually to sort of help get other. It's always to celebrate whoever's leading it, but then get who's not there, whatever demographics are missing, um, whatever disciplines are missing from the conversation. It's how do you bring them in, and raise the level of learning and consciousness and capacity, for the placemaking conversation in that country, in that region. The U.S. the placemaking movement kind of emerged, more from bids, because there was a vacuum of leadership. The government wasn't supporting, and so it was more sort of grassroots energy, merchants associations, and bids that have stepped up. And so that's that sort of place governance level is really what we're seeing the trajectory of innovation around the world on so many fronts, especially as democracy and sort of toxic nationalism isn't working very well in a lot of places. It's an opportunity to reinvent participation, government, democracy from the community scale, where it best works, where government's actually most efficient, and put
Right.
back up too. How that gets people to trust government and each other, and it places, as people can move in where they like and invest where they like more and more. It's at the destination, the district scale, where people will most succeed, and so places they need to thrive and work more than ever. They're competing with each other on not just for livability, but for what we call lovability.
I love that. And I'm actually surprised by your answer because the I've obviously spoken to less, outside of the US who are leading placemaking, but some of the illusions that I've gotten are that it might be easier when the municipality is leading the placemaking because they've kind of got, they've got the key to the city. So the red tape, if they say yes and they're like, hey, here's a budget, you can do it, your limitations seem like they would be less intrusive on the projects that you're leading. Like here in Tampa, with the projects that I've led, it's a lot of red tape to get through and to be like, hey, you trusted us last time. We'll prove it to you again. And they give an inch at a time. Whereas I've heard, municipalities in Europe, they'll be like, hey, here's a budget and you've got the space. So it's nice to know that there is some in between and it's not completely a stark difference.
Yeah, there's strengths and weaknesses to every situation, and a crisis and a deficit can be exactly what's needed to enable the, like, as I said with the story in Detroit. You need the stories, the unfoldings, the tensions, the mistakes, bad ideas. So many great successful placemaking processes started with something bad happening or crazy people, crazy ideas. It's not a stasis and comfort when there's just when everything's kind of okay. It's actually that's the hardest situation sometimes. And it really is about great places are about people and localized leadership, and government isn't always set up to deliver that. We want government to succeed, and we love an efficient government, and we want public spaces to be publicly owned. And there are plenty of exceptions and opportunities that have gotten to that path through different means.
Absolutely. So, given the surplus amount of individuals that you've spoken to and worked with to, either convene the consensus of a project or just to, have a friendly conversation like we're doing now, what is, I would say, I would love to know what is the number one question or challenge you hear most frequently, aside from municipality red tape? Because I think we all know that that one is kind of, a given.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the obstacles are actually quite common all over the world. Yeah, there's red tape, the silos of different departments and sectors and disciplines. We really do, we find that the disciplines are actually the biggest obstacle. Um, that they feel like they're supposed to lead and have the answers. And, the sort of the more famous, the architect or planner, developer, the more they lead with their brand and sort of squash the creativity and capacity of communities, and ultimately the demand for their discipline too, I think. But of course we have to mention that the biggest obstacle in most cities to better public spaces is actually the transportation paradigm, is how we plan for
Absolutely.
cars and traffic, um, and we need to not be against cars and traffic before people and places. And that's the Detroit story. Many stories show that when you lead with people and places, and create a spot where people go to, not through. That's the only way you really shift the paradigm. It's not just pushing bike lanes or walking or transit, not just infrastructure. It's not a design problem, really. It's actually it's a place problem, and we need to reinvent our regions or our downtowns around destinations to go to, not through. Ultimately, I think like autonomous vehicles, these could be the worst thing to happen to cities or the best thing. But we have to make sure the transportation paradigm really leads with destinations to go to, not through, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, cars and traffic, then, I think are probably the biggest obstacle to better public spaces, and people, merchants, associations, everyone talk about, parking is the issue, and that's unfortunately not the case, because it's the most loved places on the planet have huge parking problems. You're not a good place unless you have a parking problem, and you want people to be able to get to the place, but the best way for people to get to the place is have a place worth going to, and feel okay parking a few blocks out and doing many things in that destination. You're not going to compete with a suburban area with parking access. You're going to compete by having lots of places to go and lots of things to do.
I feel like parking really is. I was expecting you to mention parking because parking, I feel like, is always that number one kind of heel that no one seems to figure out yet. It's okay, you either have historic great transit in your area and parking's not a problem, Or you have an area that's so dense and has a ton of parking, but you can't flip that parking because it's privately owned. So then you look at street parking, and then there's, micro transit, and then there's ride share, and it's all of the solutions are having to build off of an archaic grid and an archaic way of functioning. And I think it would be really amazing when the day comes that we can all figure out this like one or two solution based on when your city was built of how to fix the parking and the transportation and accessibility issue. Because I think when it comes to parking, it's not just about ease of access, it's also that inclusive, economically accessible routes. So, are there affordable bus routes? Can people that don't live in a, higher median income area, can they make it to that place? So, how accessible is that journey for every type of person in your community? So, I think that's a really important conversation for someone to figure out.
Yeah, and again though, these challenges can't be figured out by the disciplines that created them. In a sense, it
Mm-hmm.
needs a place solution to then draw on the progressive solutions of the various disciplines. But it's so that's why again why we need placemaking leaders to be facilitating the visions for their downtowns, for their communities, to really enable the full paradigm shift. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. And that's what we're involved with and connected those people that are trying to turn around their downtowns, really in most cities around the world, and it's a long term process of building that ecosystem of community of leaders in a downtown that can enable that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really that kind of, I feel like a lot of people in the industry always say that outside looking in lens, because when you're inside of it for so long, you don't know how to see it differently. And so the place, our placemakers are the individuals who can come from the outside looking in and say, hey, like, I see this hole here. Did you notice?
Yeah.
And so, no, I love the movement. I love the work that you all are doing to really help push that narrative and bring light to the professionals that are trying to be the glue and be the other lens and see all the puzzle pieces to a project. Um, I have a couple other questions, and some of them are just fun. I would love to know your favorite city outside of Detroit, because I think Detroit is your favorite from its growth. But out of all the places you've been, like, where are you like, man, I could never leave here?
That's tough. I mean, I yeah, that's I love a lot of cities. Cities that come to mind. Whenever I go to a new city, I go to the markets, and so like La Paz, Bolivia had incredible markets. Havana, Cuba, it's the informal social life. The children in the streets are amazing. Mexico City is probably the city I most love outside of I'm a New Yorker, but and I've
Right.
lived there my whole life, so I love New York. And New York's having a really wonderful moment right now, and that people are feeling like they can shape the city again, and feeling sort of free to the sort of cultural creativity there is really powerful at the moment. But yeah, but Mexico City, I'd say it would be the city I've maybe actually learned the most from, and I've gotten to visit more than 30 times over the last 40 years, and um, so that's and we have an amazing team of collaborators, partners there with Placemaking Mexico, and they host incredible conferences and events, and working in all different contexts around the city and around the country. So yeah, and I think a lot of placemaking around the world needs to actually learn from good informal placemaking from informal communities. We need more
Yes.
informality of all kinds, informal governance and vending and retail and just people that know how to be part of public spaces. A lot of our culture in the U.S. has sort of forgotten how to use public space and um, how to compete to contribute. And in the best markets and the best vending situations and retail streets, every vendor, every customer actually competes to contribute to the shared experience of everybody else. Just by smiling, by connecting, by using their money in ways to add to the that support the place, and the vendors have the most beauty and connection and relationships in that community. So you get the most virtuous cycles, that you get the most place-led development. That's how you really seed a place with people and products that are contributing to that place.
I love that. I'm so excited for everything that you all have um, in the queue and the places that you'll get to visit and the stories you'll have. And I think stepping outside of the US and really thinking, being able to expose yourself to different cultures just brings back such an authentic and deep connection of information and stories that you can share. If there's one thing that you could tell someone who just entered the placemaking industry, they don't really know what it means, they maybe haven't read the definition yet, but you needed to give them one piece of advice or one thing to read or whatever that piece of education is, what would it be?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think again, the people that are doing placemaking aren't defined too much by one discipline. I think a lot of people go into the various built environment disciplines for the right reasons because they're really passionate about place, and sometimes they get too trained by sort of to sell one set of solutions and be that sort of expert, be rarefied in that language. So again, I think the people that have most learned placemaking, there's some academic programs and lots of training opportunities available. Like we have a platform that provides free and affordable placemaking training called placemaking.education. The people that have really succeeded at placemaking are the ones that have sort of have had to do a project themselves and had to learn every skill along the way. And the idea of these networks that we're trying to support is that just to have people more seamlessly be able to draw on each other and at the right times and look at locally, regionally, globally, as sort of look at these ecosystems of connections where all the skills and solutions are there. And yeah, sometimes it does help to have an outsider come in and be a catalyst, but really to bring people together locally. So if you're starting out, in the field, find a project, find mentors, reach out to these networks to learn from and connect to people that are doing this from different angles, and recognize that everyone has, whoever their strengths are also blocking. Whoever's leading at any level is also blocking, but celebrate them, and we then look for how do we find energy in people that are representing different perspectives and strengths to balance them out. So these networks at every scale need to be diverse and energizing, and there needs to be some friction, and bad ideas can be really useful in all of them too. So it's an ongoing, infinite learning journey that we're all on how we best work together to shape places to basically to keep humanity on this planet. That's the fear, but also the potential of place and placemaking is infinite. We always say, just like love has infinite potential, place is something that people can infinitely project on purpose and meaning to, and we're just scratching the surface of the power of place to support people.
I love that. And I love that advice. I get asked pretty frequently, how did you become a placemaker? And my response is always, I became one without knowing it. It just kind of happened organically. You end up, your feet land in the right spot and you start to discover that what you're interested in and what your passions are and how you're pulled to people all starts to make sense. When I graduated college, I was like, just want to do something that benefits people and the environments that they exist in. And I had no idea what that meant until, fast forward over a decade and I'm like, oh, I'm a placemaker and I always have been and I just didn't know it. So I think that's great advice and I'm really excited for the industry to continue to grow. Is there anything that you are like, oh, I really want to talk about this project or I want to say this one thing before we kind of wrap up?
Um, I guess I'd say we're having success, sort of connecting the placemaking movement. We think has grown sort of linearly, and that's been always been the goal. It keeps getting co-opted, and it gets trendy. But if you look back on the last really 25 years, 30 years actually that I've been involved in sort of trying to build this movement, it's actually been pretty steady linear growth, and with moving at the speed of trust and of people, sort of individual relationships and people that we really trust that are doing this work. And and again, there's imbalances and there's sort of spikes and such, but overall it's a steady growth. But our frustration is that it's not yet shaping development and land use enough. So, while there are people now in most cities that are trying to, there's infinite amount they can and still are needed to do to activate public spaces. We think the best way to really support them and grow their impact in the field is to connect placemaking more with development. So your beautiful definition that you started this with around place-led development is really the focus we're moving into. There's so many agendas we have people working on that are cross-cutting agendas amongst the networks. There's actually 40 of them, and we've had 2 global summits on all 40 of them, on refugee placemaking and Black placemaking and placemaking for health and or LGBTQ plus. There's groups of people working on all these different areas. But the one we're focused on, we think that can really best support them all, is place-led development. In the U.S., our partner is with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, actually, to convene leaders on this topic. There are summits and networks on several other continents focusing on this as well. But we think the dominant problem and crisis is around the world is of place taking, is extractive development, where most development, but also parks and streets and the way they're planned are still extractive of the shared value of place. It's not building capacity.
And a lot of restrictions.
And, lots of restrictions and a sort of top down still. And so we think the way to to turn that around isn't to be against that, but to show that when we lead with place and placemaking, we can attract development that adds to place and create a virtuous cycle between the two. And so we're excited. There are models of this in most contexts around the world that we've been lucky to be involved with and connect with people leading that. So we want to tell their stories, amplify them. Downtown Detroit is one of place-led development. But we're in the process of doing really deep case studies of these projects and trying to connect and convene the people doing this work, because we think that's ultimately how we're going to save the planet for people and have place-led development be the dominant paradigm of development. And again, as people can move where they like and live where they like, they're going to choose places that have a higher ratio of shared value to private value. We call this place capitalism. So the corporate capitalism is sort of understood as this very extractive, destructive force, but there's people sort of have succumbed to it because there are no real alternatives, and it is working in some levels. So we see the only way to sort of ramp off of it or towards a more healthy capitalism is towards what we call place capitalism. Is place is the shared value that we forget to invest in, and placemakers are the people that are leading that and convening that investment in every corner of the world. We invest in social capital, human capital, cultural capital, health capital, financial capital, obviously, and the built capital. But place capital is the one that has the most synergies with all of those, and anchors them, connects them, and also it has the most infinite potential for shared value. So we want the shared value of the public realm to go up exponentially and sustain and support the private value of the investment around it.
Amazing. Well, Ethan, thank you so much for helping us launch Third Placemakers Talk. This was so insightful. I couldn't have thought of a better first guest. Truly appreciate your time, your perspective, and everything you've done to help shape this movement and shape other places and really champion for better public spaces around the world. And thank you to everyone listening. Thank you for joining us for our first episode. If today's conversation changed the way you think about places, be sure to subscribe, share it with someone who loves cities and communities, and join us next time as we continue exploring the people and ideas shaping the places around us.